A bombshell new lawsuit that involves Sean Diddy Combs, but isn't against the disgraced music mogul. As Diddy is listening to closing arguments in his sex trafficking and racketeering trial in federal court in New York, his son, Justin, has been hit with a lawsuit by a woman who claims that he lured her to Los Angeles to be raped by multiple men.
Diddy's name is back under a harsh spotlight, but this time the scrutiny doesn't stop with him. It has widened, pulling his son into the conversation and raising uncomfortable questions that the public can no longer ignore. What was once dismissed as rumor has now become a wave of attention that refuses to fade.
His dad's arm around his shoulder. Justin has been in court supporting his dad, just as his siblings have been over the past 7 weeks of testimony. Now, listen, whatever your feelings are on Sean Combs and whether you think he's guilty of the charges that could put him in federal prison for the rest of his life, you just have to think how difficult it must be to hear about all the sexual exploits of their father. But if you believe the allegations I'm about to tell you in this new lawsuit brought against Justin Combs, Justin apparently was very aware of his dad's lifestyle. The new lawsuit that just dropped was filed by a woman from Louisiana who says in 2017, Justin Combs coaxed her to come to LA because she says that Diddy's son promised her a job in the entertainment industry. She claims the two had met on Snapchat, and Justin allegedly asked for explicit pictures, and she sent them. The woman, who's not named in this suit, says when she got to LA, she was raped by several men, including a certain music mogul now at the center of this high-profile, historic trial in federal court in Lower Manhattan. Yes, Sean Diddy Combs. The alleged victim claims that Justin invited her out west for a weekend to talk about her career. But when she got there, she says she was kept in a house in Beverly Hills. And according to the lawsuit, things seemed fine at first, but when she allegedly asked Justin Combs if they were going to leave the house, he said no. She claims that Justin Combs offered her alcohol, pills, and weed, and she thinks that the weed was laced. Now, you can see in those allegations some of the comparisons in this lawsuit to the so-called freak-offs that we have been allegedly wore a face covering that he likened to a Muslim hijab. In the lawsuit against Justin Combs, the alleged victim says that she knew that one of the men was Diddy just because of his mannerisms, but how about this? She also knew it was Diddy because she says that Justin, as his dad entered the home to allegedly rape a woman that he brought to LA, called Diddy, quote, Pops. Now, we see on Justin's social media that Pops is the phrase that he often uses for his dad. In this lawsuit, the alleged victim claims that she was led to a bedroom where she was allegedly told, quote, you better let this happen or else. Then she says that each man took a turn raping her, calling it a, quote, brutal gang rape. After that, she was taken to an airport on Monday and flown home. Not only is Diddy facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison if convicted of all the charges in his sex trafficking and racketeering trial, there have been nearly 80 lawsuits filed against him in civil court. Many are still active. Several of the lawsuits accuse Diddy of sexual abuse and are filed by people who are not giving their names, just like in this lawsuit that we're talking about. This also isn't the first lawsuit that Justin Combs has recently faced,
forcing both father and son into the center of a growing storm. The shift happened quietly at first, a few mentions online, subtle references in legal filings, industry insiders speaking in careful language. Then suddenly, the tone changed, the whispers grew louder, the focus sharpened, and the narrative expanded beyond Diddy alone. People began asking how deep the connections run, who knew what, and when. Not accusations, questions, but questions powerful enough to shake an already fragile image. For years, Diddy cultivated the idea of legacy, not just success for himself, but continuity through his children. Public appearances framed them as protected, polished, and far removed from controversy, but legacy cuts both ways. When scrutiny arrives, it doesn't always respect generational boundaries. And now, attention has turned toward whether proximity to power created blind spots that are finally being examined. Sources close to the situation say the pressure is intense. Lawyers are cautious. Statements are...
Do we know that Sean Combs was there? Do we actually know that he was present in LA? These things aren't difficult to find out, but it's those baby steps to trying to build the foundation of a lawsuit to see what's realistic that really matter in a case like this. And as you so correctly said, we want victims of domestic violence, of sexual violence, and so on and so forth to actually be compensated accordingly. Unfortunately, when we have circumstances where we have somebody famous who's been charged with crimes, we have somebody famous who's been sued, there can be instances where other folks jump on the bandwagon. And I'm not suggesting that's what's happening here, but it is something that everyone needs to look at skeptically.
Right, absolutely. If you were to bring a lawsuit against someone like Justin Combs, or any of these, and even the cases involving his dad, and you're bringing a civil suit, what facts do you need to have? I mean, certainly if you have a victim who says that this happened and they're ready to, they're able to provide some corroborating evidence that something happened, what do you actually need to be able to go to the courthouse and say, I'm filing a lawsuit against this person?
I think that you need to have somebody who's willing to state under oath that this is what happened to me, that this is what I'm alleging, these are my damages, this is how it's impacted me. And as an attorney, again, I would want to make sure, especially in a lawsuit like this, where it involves a high profile person, but quite frankly, in any lawsuit, that there is some corroborating information out there so that my lawsuit isn't tossed out of court pretty quickly.
And reading through this complaint, it mentions several other lawsuits. You have the lawsuit from Rodney Jones, who's known as Little Rod, and Sean Combs is facing that lawsuit, and his son was named in it, but has since been dropped. What do you make about it having all these other different cases and elements brought in? What is the attorney here trying to prove?
Well, it almost appears as if the attorney is saying, where there's smoke, there's fire. So here are all these other lawsuits, and I've reviewed the complaint, and they talk about them in some detail. They don't just list them. They say, this happened on this date, and this person sued Sean Combs here, and this person sued Sean Combs here for this set of facts and circumstances. And they're essentially trying to say, because there's all these other lawsuits, you should give this one a stamp of approval, because again, where there's smoke, there's fire.
Tony Busby, his law firm is bringing this. He has been in the civil world a very, very prominent name. For those who don't know him, and you work in criminal defense, what do you know about Tony Busby? Knowing that it's his law firm bringing this, what does that tell you?
I don't think that the Busby law firm is taking these allegations lightly. I believe they have the resources to do their own investigations prior to actually filing these suits. So this isn't some, sole practitioner who's trying to jump on the cottage industry that's been created around suing Sean Combs. I think that they have the ability to investigate this. They have the ability to decide whether or not they want to take on these cases.
Every word is weighed because the stakes are no longer just about reputation, they're about responsibility. In moments like this, silence becomes strategy. But silence also fuels speculation. The absence of clear answers leaves space for narratives to grow, and the public fills that space quickly. What makes this moment different is timing. Diddy is already navigating reputational damage on multiple fronts. The industry that once shielded him with loyalty is quieter now. The benefit of the doubt is thinner. So when a new controversy emerges, especially one that brushes against family, the reaction is immediate and unforgiving. The court of public opinion doesn't wait for context. It demands accountability first and explanations later. Social media has amplified every development. Clips are dissected, old interviews are replayed, family photos are reinterpreted, innocent moments are reframed under a suspicious lens. This is how scrutiny works in real time. Nothing exists in isolation, and history is rewritten through the present.
Maybe most shocking moments from the series, and then we'll get to the C&D letter. So to do all that, I want to welcome back on Elizabeth Vulai, legal counsel here at Law and Crime, who knows a thing or two about the inner workings of the media and when things are brought in. But you also watched the entire show. Elizabeth, it's good to see you. Thanks for taking the time. Now, you watched all of it. What was your main takeaway from the series? As somebody who actively followed the Diddy criminal case, has been here on Sidebar talking about the case, talking about his civil cases that he's facing. What was your main takeaway?
Yeah, there were a couple of takeaways. I think it was a really sort of original documentary, well put together. There were 4 episodes, usually most of them around an hour long, so it's very thorough. I think the 2 key takeaways were, one, everybody's talking about access to this footage and where it came from. One of the things that I think Diddy had done was he had said he'd hired a videographer. He's someone who films himself, as we've come to know, for most of his career and life. So he had hired this videographer to kind of follow him through this process. I'm not sure if the thinking was, he thought that he might evade the charges and come out with his own documentary afterwards. But just the access of footage that we get, we hear him speaking to his legal team. It's very rare you get an insight into that because, again, that's usually covered under attorney-client privilege. So speaking to his legal team, kind of his own thoughts about what was going on, because also remember, at this point, we really hadn't heard Diddy talk much about this. He had issued an apology over that video of him and Cassandra Ventura in that hotel hallway months before, but he hadn't really given any interviews to the media. He hadn't spoken about it, probably on advice of his attorneys. So getting access to that kind of information was really something that we had never seen before. It's what a lot of people are talking about. And I think the other thing that struck me was just how in depth it went. There's been a lot of documentaries and coverage on the Diddy case. People are covering the allegations, him and Cassandra Ventura. But, one of the episodes goes into his history with Biggie and Tupac and insinuations there and kind of going a little bit deeper into his upbringing and his career, a little bit further beyond what a lot of other people have covered.
By the way, yeah, we're talking cease and desist letter here, potential legal action, maybe financial repercussions. You might not.
That's enough.
And lastly for you, kind of an on-the-spot question. If you had to guess how much Sean Combs' legal fees are for fighting back on these civil cases, I mean, ballpark, what would you think?
Are we talking about just the civil cases, or are we gonna?
Well, let's start with civil first, because then he has, the starting, like the all-star team of lawyers on his criminal side as well, and I'm sure that's not cheap.
The 2025 dream team, as it were.
Right.
I can't even begin to imagine what this looks like. I just can't. I mean, we're talking about tens of millions of dollars at a base level. $100 million if we're throwing in the criminal cases. I mean, there's a lot. There's a lot.
Yeah, it is. Because I think too, like even if you were to, not be able to afford a top flight lawyer for even one of these cases, and that lawyer.
Everybody was watching our coverage here on Law and Crime about the trial. And by the way, found out that my voice and Elizabeth Milner's voice, Queen Elizabeth, were both in the documentary, I think in like episode 4 when it was going into the trial or in his arrest. It was interesting. I'll talk more. I am curious about what you think of that footage, and we'll talk about how it factors into the cease and desist letter. First of all, no attorney-client privilege, because if he is actively, deliberately, knowingly recording that, the privilege, anything that he says to his attorney.
People close to Diddy insist that assumptions are dangerous, that speculation is not evidence, and that no conclusions should be drawn without facts. But they also admit the damage is already happening. Once doubt enters the conversation, it's hard to remove, especially when power, wealth, and influence are part of the story. The public doesn't just want answers, they want transparency. For Diddy's son, the pressure is different but no less heavy. Growing up in the shadow of a global icon means identity is never fully separate. Every move is interpreted through the lens of inheritance. Supporters argue that proximity does not equal involvement, that being related does not mean being responsible. Critics counter that proximity creates access, and access invites questions. Behind closed doors, the mood is reportedly tense. Advisors urge caution. Legal teams prepare for every possible scenario. Family members are said to be circling inward, protecting privacy while trying to manage perception. It's a delicate balance, and one wrong move could escalate the situation further.
If we're going to cast a bit of a wider net, people are talking about family members, other celebrities, maybe some employees like Christina Forum, but I think the most likely would be those two sons.
Why do you think it's the most likely about those two? Just because of the recordings, the allegations against him? What are you thinking?
I think so. I think obviously they're just civil allegations, and those cases are going to be put on hold while the criminal case plays out. But, there is some smoke there. And obviously, there's a presumption of innocence and there's a lower standard in a civil case. But you have someone who's been named directly as someone who participated in a sexual assault, and everything else has been rumors and speculation. But here you at least have one verified complaint.
And what's interesting about this situation? It's the sexual assault civil allegation filed by Grace O'Marquez. This is against Christian Combs, as you're referring to it. And Diddy is a co-defendant in this case because she says he facilitated it. It was on a yacht that Diddy had rented. But it was Christian, the one who allegedly sexually assaulted her. I mean, so how does all of that relate? The fact that we have Diddy, who's also part of this, but it's mostly on Christian in this instance?
Yeah, in this particular instance, like you said, it did take place on a yacht. She was someone who was working at the time, and Little Rod was there apparently, and obviously he's a plaintiff in a civil lawsuit himself. But whenever you are a plaintiff in a civil case, you obviously want to go after someone with the ability to pay. That's what we call a deep pocket. So even though Diddy might not have personally participated in this alleged incident, you really want to wrap him in as a co-defendant because obviously his ability to pay any judgment is going to be very different than Christian or Justin or any of the other of the 7 children.
Do you think that Grace O'Marquez, the plaintiff in this yacht criminal or civil lawsuit rather, do you think that the feds would reach out to her and ask her about her experience perhaps?
I do, and this is why. Apparently, and obviously I haven't heard him, she has recordings of this incident, audio recordings, and we know how powerful video evidence is. We've talked about it with Cassie Ventura and how that really maybe even shift the direction of this case entirely because, of course, Combs denied everything until CNN got a hold of that video in May. And we're talking about a lawsuit that was filed in April, I believe, and again, I don't know if it's true, but the allegations are that much of this was recorded and there's audio recordings. And if so, and she's saying no, and Christian is moving forward anyway, then you have attempted sexual assault.
Talking about audio and video recordings, that's what's huge in this case. I mean, we heard a lot about it from Cassie in her lawsuit, then of course Lil Rod, and now confirmed in the federal indictment that the feds are saying, yep, we've got some, and that's what led to this indictment and his charges. But what's interesting is that in Lil Rod's lawsuit, he actually has photos, like screenshots of a recording of Justin Combs, and he says it's allegedly with a sex worker. Do you think that part is incriminating too, that the feds may be looking at that recording?
I do, and
The industry is watching closely, not because it enjoys scandal, but because moments like this force uncomfortable reckonings. How much protection does fame provide? Where does responsibility begin and end? And when scrutiny spreads, who deserves the benefit of the doubt? What's clear is that this isn't just about one headline. It's about how power operates in silence, how families tied to influence are examined when questions surface, and how quickly narratives can shift when trust is already weakened. The spotlight doesn't dim, it intensifies. For now, there are more questions than answers. The scrutiny continues, the pressure builds, and whether this moment fades or deepens will depend on what comes next, what is clarified, and how those involved choose to respond. Because once a scandal steps out of the shadows, it rarely goes back quietly. Diddy's name has never left the spotlight, but this time the attention feels different. He's not standing alone at the center of it anymore. The focus has widened, pulling his son into the conversation and igniting a level of scrutiny that goes beyond rumors and headlines.
Here, they listened to the testimony and they said, there are so many victims here. I believe that I am one too. We don't know what prompted it. I think the timing is interesting, but I don't know that I can make anything of it as we sit here right now.
I think of recently you had Tyler Perry, prominent name in Hollywood, very different case, but accused of sexual violence and sexual harassment, workplace harassment with an actor who had worked on one of his shows, and the actor provided text messages in the complaint. This doesn't have that. Very different case. But does that, the fact that there's not that visual evidence that we can look at, and I don't know what type of visual evidence would exist in a case like this, but the fact that we don't particularly have those, does that take away from the weight of what this lawsuit may actually be in the end when it comes to the truth?
Well, I think we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit here because
Sure.
the filing of a complaint is just simply the first step, and all the complaint needs to do on paper anyway is set forth the factual allegations that are enough to sort of not get the case thrown out at the first few stages, and that bar is pretty low. So there may be tons of evidence surrounding these allegations that aren't in the lawsuit. They don't need to be in the lawsuit. Again, there needs to be just enough to get us through those first few steps. Excuse me.
As Sean Combs, we're awaiting, once the jury gets the case next week, and then we'll see what the verdict is. But guilty or not guilty, he's going to be dealing with a lot of civil cases that are still pending. What does the timeline look like for Sean Combs? Let's just say he's found not guilty of everything. What does the legal timeline look for him? How long could he be dealing with the issues related to all these civil suits?
That's a great question. First of all, I don't think he's going to be found not guilty of everything. So that's a separate issue entirely.
Yeah.
Having said that, again, different jurisdictions have different statutes of limitations for sex assault victims to bring lawsuits within which, or timelines within which they can bring the lawsuits. And so again, depending on where allegations come from, those statutes of limitations can be very long. It also matters on how old the alleged victim was at the time that the incident took place. For example, there have been a number of states which have extended statutes of limitations for minors who were sexually assaulted. Those statutes of limitations are much longer than for adults who've been sexually assaulted. So it really does depend. And I know that's not quite answering the question, but I suppose the easiest answer is it could go on for quite some time.
And you look at this complaint, the complaint is for sexual assault and battery, gender violence, negligent supervision. I think a lot of people would look at this and they'd certainly, if all of this is true, what a horrific experience that this victim went through. Why is this not a criminal case?
That's a great question. And I suppose that this victim could have brought this to the county attorney's office or whatever local prosecutorial body there are. We don't know the answer to that. Perhaps quite frankly, we simply don't know the answer to that. But it's also important to remember this, that Sean Combs is named in this lawsuit. I have reviewed this lawsuit.
What was once dismissed as noise from the outside has turned into sustained pressure, and it's forcing uncomfortable conversations that no amount of influence can silence. This didn't erupt overnight. It crept in slowly, almost unnoticed. A mention here, a reference there, subtle shifts in how insiders spoke, how journalists framed their questions, how online discussions started connecting dots that were never connected before. Then suddenly, the tone changed, the whispers grew louder, the attention sharpened, and the narrative expanded from one man to a family legacy now under examination. For years, Diddy carefully shaped an image of control and continuity. He didn't just build businesses, he built a dynasty. His children were presented as extensions of that vision, protected from controversy, positioned as the next generation of success. But legacy is fragile. When scrutiny arrives, it doesn't stop at titles or bloodlines. It spreads outward, challenging the idea that influence can insulate anyone completely. What's fueling this moment is not a single confirmed event, but the convergence of timing, attention, and unresolved questions. Diddy is already navigating intense public pressure.
Costs, that's when he had said, we'll be charging this to the estate, allegedly. One of the other things was he had wanted to put out that song about Biggie after he had passed away, and that was really a big moment. He had performed it at the MTV Movie Awards. And then one of the other claims was, Biggie was set to debut on the cover of Rolling Stone, or at least be on the cover of Rolling Stone. And allegedly, one of the interviewees says after he had passed, Sean Combs had called him and said, I'm coming out with my first solo album. I need that cover. So Sean Combs had allegedly taken that cover from Biggie even after he had passed away. And again, it kind of rides to this theme of, in the public, his friend had passed away. He was devastated. But sort of what you see behind the scenes, at least what the documentary is alleging, is all the different ways he's using that to help benefit him financially and in terms of his career, which is something that we hadn't seen before. And, even myself, like I'm sure you empathize, Jesse, as a millennial, we grew up seeing Diddy, knowing the backstory of him and Biggie and sort of knowing that song and thinking, oh, they were close friends. He paid tribute to his friend. That's so moving. And then to hear all of these allegations, it really paints, another picture.
I remember when that happened. It was such a sad time. And to think about them dedicating a song to his close friend, I mean, it hit an emotional core. You looked at Diddy in a totally different light. Now, these, again, are a different narrative, a different allegation. We're trying to piece it together. I do want to get into the jurors, okay? So the jurors at the trial. Before we do, let me just highlight a couple more things, and then we'll get into the jurors in the cease and desist letter. So one gripping moment in the series, I got to call it out, came when Aubrey O'Day, again, this former Danity Kane member who spoke out against Combs after Cassie had filed her lawsuit, reads this affidavit from another unidentified person that detailed an alleged sexual assault against her. And in that affidavit, the witness said they walked in on Combs and another man performing sex acts on O'Day, who the witness said appeared to be heavily inebriated, was just lying there. And O'Day became emotional when she was reading this, saying she'd never actually seen this document, had only heard it read to her over the phone, and she said she had no memory of that happening to her, which is just, it's a really powerful moment. Someone else who worked closely with Combs was producer Rodney Little Rod Jones, who was also interviewed for the series. We've talked about him a lot here on Sidebar because he detailed several of the incidents that he had previously included in a lawsuit against Combs, including that he believes Combs drugged him on multiple occasions. He also claims that he worked with Combs for a year on the last album he put out, actually living with Combs during that time. But his allegation is he claims he never got paid for his work. And the documentary included alleged voice messages from Combs where he assured Little Rod that he would get paid eventually and that he was making a big deal out of nothing. But now I got to talk about the jurors. Okay, so we heard from two of the jurors who served on the jury during Combs' federal criminal trial in New York. So Juror 75 and Juror 160. They spoke about the split verdict.
The industry that once treated him as untouchable has grown quieter. Support that used to be automatic now comes with hesitation. So when attention began drifting toward his son, it landed on ground already weakened by doubt. People close to the situation say the atmosphere has changed dramatically. Conversations are guarded, language is precise, every public appearance is calculated, every silence is deliberate. Because when scrutiny reaches this level, words can either calm the situation or pour gasoline on it. And silence, while strategic, often creates space for speculation to grow unchecked. Social media has played its role, as it always does. Old interviews are resurfaced, past photos are reinterpreted, innocent moments are pulled into new narratives. The internet doesn't ask for context before forming opinions. It builds stories from fragments, patterns, and assumptions, then spreads them at a speed that no publicist can outrun. Supporters argue that proximity does not equal involvement, that being related to power does not mean being responsible for it. They point out the danger of conflating legacy with guilt.
There are going to be defendants in the lawsuit if the allegation is that they were forced to perform these sex acts and it wasn't just a commercial transaction. So you can rely on that testimony. Obviously, Lil Rod himself, but he's a plaintiff, so his testimony may be biased, may be true, but it's certainly something that you would want more of if you are a prosecutor. And then you look to video and you look to other types of evidence, maybe text messages, something that corroborates what Lil Rod has said. And of course, if you have someone like Horam who flips, that would be very, very helpful for prosecutors because we know that former employees, they usually have a lot of information and they can be leveraged in a criminal case or even a civil one to cooperate to save themselves.
I want to talk more about that, the flipping of all of this, because right now Diddy is the only one who has been charged federally in relation to this scheme, this alleged scheme. But as you pointed out, there are other people who have been identified as participants in all this. Christina Quorum obviously is the main one, along with the Combs enterprise or empire, whatever you want to call it. She has not yet been charged, but I'm pretty sure, as you've told me in the past, probably this interview and many others, the feds are going to be talking to Christina Quorum, and it would be in her best interest likely to cooperate with them. But what about Justin and Christian? I mean, they're so close to Diddy. They're his sons, and they have accusations against them. They could, as you said, face these charges in the future. What do you think? Do you think that they would flip?
I think it's a lot less likely that Justin and Christian would flip. I've seen children testify against their parents. We've seen it on Law and Crime many times, and obviously it makes for great drama and courtroom theatrics. But I think in a case like this, it's going to be less likely. They really owe everything to their father, right?
Of turning family ties into implied narratives, critics counter that proximity brings access, and access raises questions, not accusations, but questions that people believe deserve answers. For Diddy's son, the weight is uniquely heavy. Growing up under a famous name means identity is never fully independent. Every achievement is viewed through the lens of inheritance. Every mistake is magnified. And now, every silence is interpreted. The scrutiny doesn't just follow him, it defines the space around him. Behind closed doors, the response is said to be cautious and tense. Legal teams are preparing for every angle, not because conclusions have been reached, but because perception alone can cause damage. Advisors are urging restraint. Family members are reportedly closing ranks, trying to protect privacy while navigating an environment that demands transparency. What makes this moment so volatile is the broader context. Public trust in powerful figures has eroded. People are less willing to accept surface-level explanations. They want clarity, they want accountability, and they want to know whether systems of influence have allowed things to stay hidden for too long. In that climate,